It wasn't bombs, tanks, or bullets that broke them, it was something far quieter. Entire German units, trained to fight to the last man, began surrendering without a single shot fired. Their officers couldn't understand it. Their radios worked, their supplies were full, yet their will was gone. This wasn't coincidence. It was a weapon, invisible, intelligent, and terrifyingly effective. The Allies had discovered a new kind of warfare, one that targeted not the body, but the mind. Through whispers, deception, and fear, they created an illusion so powerful that battle-hardened soldiers laid down their arms to shadows that didn't exist. This was the war of nerves, where truth was twisted, lies became orders, and courage melted into confusion. And behind it all, was a plan so secret, even those who carried it out never fully knew how deep the game really went. World War II was not only fought with steel and fire, it was fought with fear, with rumor, and with the human mind itself. As the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, they realized that brute force alone could not break an enemy so deeply indoctrinated, so fanatically loyal. But where guns failed, psychology began to win. Behind the front lines, a small group of intelligence officers, writers, and artists were quietly crafting one of the most ingenious operations of the entire war. Their mission was simple in words, but extraordinary in execution, to make the enemy believe they were already defeated. Through forged documents, fake radio broadcasts, planted rumors, and even sound recordings of phantom armies, they built an illusion so convincing that entire German divisions began to crumble from within. It wasn't strength that conquered them, it was doubt. And in that moment, the battlefield changed forever. Because when you can control what a man believes, you no longer need to fight him. This is the untold story of how imagination, deception, and psychological warfare turned the tide of World War II, without a single bullet fired. By 1944, the world was burning on every front. The Allies had landed in Normandy, the Soviet armies were tearing through the east, and Germany, once unstoppable, was beginning to fracture under the weight of its own empire. But even as their cities crumbled and their armies retreated, one thing about the Germans refused to break: their belief. For Hitler's soldiers, surrender was not an option, it was shame. They had been conditioned to see it as betrayal, worse than death itself. German propaganda hammered this into every soldier's mind: fight to the last bullet. Die if you must. But never give up. The Allies knew this. And they also knew that victory would be delayed, and thousands more lives would be lost, unless that belief could be shattered. So instead of fighting harder, they decided to think smarter. In the shadowy corridors of British intelligence, a plan was born. It was called Operation Bodyguard, and though its purpose was to protect the secrecy of D-Day, its methods would spark a new form of warfare: psychological warfare. Out of this came smaller, more focused operations, designed not to kill, but to confuse, to mislead, and eventually to break the enemy's will. The architects of this invisible war weren't generals or soldiers, they were playwrights, illusionists, and journalists. Men who understood not the battlefield, but the human brain. Among them were masters of deception like Sefton Delmer, a former journalist who had once reported from inside Nazi Germany. He knew the rhythm of their propaganda, the tone of their radio, and the exact voice of authority that German soldiers obeyed. Delmer proposed something radical: if German soldiers would only surrender to orders, then perhaps, all the Allies had to do was give them the wrong ones. From a secret base in England, Delmer's team began broadcasting fake German radio programs, complete with music, military updates, and speeches that sounded exactly like official Nazi communications. But within these broadcasts were subtle poisons, lies designed to corrode trust, confidence, and morale. They reported imaginary defeats, hinted at betrayal within German ranks, and spread rumors that entire divisions had been abandoned by their commanders. Slowly, the cracks began to form. Soldiers at the front, already tired, cold, and surrounded, started to whisper, "Is Berlin lying to us?" For the first time, the iron discipline of the Wehrmacht began to waver. The Allies hadn't fired a single bullet. Yet, without realizing it, the Germans were already losing, not the war of weapons, but the war of belief. And this was only the beginning. Because soon, the deception would move beyond words, into sights, sounds, and illusions so real that even the most hardened soldier would question what was true, and what was not. The brilliance of the Allied deception was not in its size, but in its subtlety. They didn't just want to mislead the enemy, they wanted to rewrite their reality. Every whisper, every forged message, every false map was part of a grand psychological mosaic designed to make the Germans question everything they thought they knew. While bombs fell from the sky, another kind of weapon was being deployed: words. Carefully crafted, strategically placed, and devastating in their precision. The British called it black propaganda. Unlike ordinary leaflets or morale-boosting speeches, this propaganda was designed to sound German. It didn't attack from outside, it crept inside the mind. Sefton Delmer's secret radio stations broadcasted under the name Gustav Siegfried Eins, a fake Nazi channel pretending to be a loyal German voice. The announcer, known as Der Chef, spoke like a patriotic officer, angry at the corruption and incompetence of the Nazi elite. He ranted about SS officers living in luxury while frontline soldiers froze and starved. To the average German soldier, listening in the trenches, this sounded believable, even courageous. It was controlled dissent, a psychological scalpel cutting straight into the heart of trust. The soldiers began to think, maybe our leaders really have betrayed us. Meanwhile, other branches of the deception network built an entire world of lies. The Ghost Army, a top-secret U.S. unit made up of artists, engineers, and sound experts, was tasked with creating the illusion of whole divisions that didn't exist. They painted inflatable tanks, used speakers to blast recorded engine noises, and even left fake campfires burning at night. To the enemy's scouts and aerial observers, these were real forces, ready to attack. German commanders, believing these illusions, shifted troops, spread thin their defenses, and walked straight into Allied traps. But the psychological game went deeper still. Leaflets dropped over German positions carried fake orders signed by real generals, instructing troops to fall back, regroup, or even surrender. Some letters were designed to look as if they came from soldiers' families, expressing despair and fear that the war was lost. Others hinted at conspiracies within the Nazi hierarchy, feeding paranoia and distrust among officers. The plan's genius lay in its understanding of the human condition. It knew that when fear and doubt enter a soldier's mind, courage cannot survive for long. And as winter closed in, the German army, once fueled by fanatical certainty, began to choke on its own confusion. Every whisper became a weapon. Every rumor, a spark of panic. The Allies had turned truth into clay, molding it to whatever shape they needed. And soon, that shape would take form on the battlefield itself, where the illusion would become so convincing, so absolute, that the Germans would surrender to enemies who were never even there. The plan was ready. The stage was set. Now it was time to unleash the greatest illusion the world had ever seen. In the months leading up to the D-Day invasion, the Allies created an entire phantom army under the command of one of their most famous generals, General Patton. The Germans feared Patton, they saw him as the Allies' most aggressive, unpredictable commander. And that's exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. The deception was called Operation Fortitude, part of the larger bodyguard network. Its purpose: convince the German high command that the main Allied invasion would land not in Normandy, but in Pas-de-Calais, 100 miles away. If it worked, tens of thousands of German troops would be trapped defending the wrong coast. But how do you make an entire army appear where none exists? That's where the Ghost Army came in. They built fake airfields, filled with rubber planes and wooden hangars. Inflatable Sherman tanks lined the fields, moving under camouflage nets to simulate activity. At night, sound engineers blasted recordings of engines, trucks, and even soldiers shouting commands, the noise of an army that didn't exist. From the air, German reconnaissance photographed everything. Tanks, barracks, artillery, all there. They saw tire tracks carved into the mud, footprints leading into tents, and smoke rising from what looked like cooking fires. To German intelligence, it was undeniable proof of a massive invasion force assembling for Calais. And that illusion didn't end with visuals. Fake radio operators spent hours transmitting coded messages about supplies, troop movements, and schedules. The British even created dummy shipping manifests, evidence of fuel, ammunition, and rations being sent to Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group. Each transmission was carefully crafted to be intercepted. The Germans decrypted the messages and believed they had cracked Allied communications, not realizing that the Allies had written the script for them to read. Meanwhile, real soldiers and agents on the ground planted rumors in French towns. Barkeeps, farmers, and even captured German spies were fed stories about the massive build-up in the southeast of England. They repeated them, and German intelligence recorded them. By the time D-Day arrived, the deception was complete. Even as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the German High Command refused to move its reserves from Calais. Hitler himself believed Normandy was a diversion, a trick to draw German forces away from the real invasion. For weeks after D-Day, elite panzer divisions remained idle, waiting for an attack that would never come. By the time the truth became clear, it was too late. The Allies had already broken through France. But perhaps the most chilling part of this entire operation wasn't the fake tanks or false radios, it was the mind game that followed. When captured German soldiers were interrogated, many of them swore they had faced Patton's Ghost Army, entire divisions of tanks and troops they could never find again. They believed they had been surrounded, outnumbered, and beaten before the first shot was fired. That was the power of the illusion. It didn't just confuse, it conquered the imagination. The Germans had been fighting shadows, and in those shadows, they lost something far greater than territory, they lost their certainty. The Allies had turned warfare into theater, and the Germans had become the audience, watching their own defeat unfold, scene by scene, in a performance they could neither escape nor understand. By the summer of 1944, the illusion had done its work. The Germans were still fighting, but not with the same conviction. Fear had crept into their ranks like fog rolling across a ruined battlefield. They began to question every order, every report, every message that came from headquarters. Was it real, or another Allied trick? Entire units were paralyzed by doubt. In some sectors of France and Belgium, German divisions held their positions for days waiting for reinforcements that didn't exist. Others retreated from enemy movements that were nothing more than sound recordings or decoy lights. The once precise war machine of the Wehrmacht was dissolving into confusion and rumor. Frontline soldiers whispered that Hitler had gone mad, that Berlin was feeding them lies to keep them fighting a lost war. Officers accused one another of sabotage. Radio operators ignored orders, fearing that they were Allied fabrications. Trust, the core of any army, had completely rotted away. The most striking moment came in late 1944, during the push through northern France. A German regiment, cut off and surrounded by what they believed was a massive Allied force, surrendered en masse. But when Allied troops entered the area, they found no such force, only a handful of reconnaissance units and a few dozen decoys. The Germans had surrendered to ghosts. One British officer described the moment in disbelief. They came out with their hands up, hundreds of them. They said they heard tanks surrounding them at night, voices shouting orders, engines roaring. But there was nothing there. Just the echo of our own recordings. Psychological warfare had achieved what bullets could not. The German soldiers were no longer defeated by strength, but by imagination. They had been made to believe they were powerless, and so they became powerless. As Allied armies pushed forward, German command structures broke down completely. The once feared discipline that had terrified Europe gave way to chaos. Soldiers deserted, officers defied orders, and entire towns surrendered without resistance. And behind every surrender, every collapse of morale, was the same invisible weapon, doubt. The Germans had spent years mastering the art of deception and propaganda, but now the tables had turned. Their own strategies had been used against them with devastating precision. The empire that had risen through manipulation of truth was now falling victim to the same poison. By the time Allied forces reached the Rhine, the war was no longer just about territory, it was about the collapse of belief itself. The German army had lost faith, in its leaders, in its cause, and even in its own senses. They had fought a war of steel, and died in a war of shadows. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, and Europe lay in ruins, the victors began to uncover the hidden weapons that had helped end the war. Among them were not new tanks or aircraft, but reels of audio tape, piles of forged documents, fake uniforms, and inflatable tanks, the tools of a psychological battlefield. The men who had wielded these weapons hadn't fought in the mud or the skies, but in the minds of their enemies. And their victories left no craters, no corpses, only silence and surrender. In post-war interrogations, captured German officers spoke of their disbelief. Many admitted they could no longer tell truth from illusion. One colonel confessed, "We began to fight ghosts. Every rumor felt like a trap. Every shadow looked like an ambush." What had started as confidence turned into paranoia, and finally, paralysis. For the Allies, this psychological victory became a revelation. It proved that wars could be shaped not only by firepower, but by information, by perception, manipulation, and fear. In the years that followed, nations across the world studied these lessons, laying the foundation for what would become the Cold War's new frontier, psychological and information warfare. But beneath the triumph, there was an uncomfortable truth. The same techniques that broke the enemy's will could also shape the minds of millions in peace, through propaganda, politics, and persuasion. The line between truth and illusion had been blurred forever. The men of the Ghost Army returned home as heroes few would ever know by name. Their operations remained classified for decades. Yet their work changed the nature of war itself. They had proven that courage was not only found on the front lines, sometimes, it was found in the quiet rooms where words and whispers were crafted into weapons. And as history would show, deception, once unleashed, never truly goes back into the box. From that moment onward, every nation learned that victory isn't just about who has the most power, but who can control what people believe. The war of guns had ended. But the war of minds had just begun. Because the greatest battlefield is not made of earth or steel, it's made of thought, fear, and imagination. And once you control that, you control everything. History remembers the tanks, the generals, and the battles, but it often forgets the whispers that ended them. The Second World War was not won by force alone, it was won by minds that dared to think beyond violence. The men and women behind the deception campaigns proved that victory can be born from creativity as much as courage. They taught the world a haunting lesson, that the human mind is the most fragile, and the most powerful, weapon of all. It can be broken without bloodshed, conquered without invasion, and rebuilt with a single idea. For the Germans who surrendered to shadows, the war ended not with explosions, but with silence, the silence of realization. And for the Allies who crafted that silence, it marked a new age of warfare, one that continues to this day. Because every conflict since has carried echoes of that invisible war, a war fought with information, illusion, and fear. In the end, the secret mind game of World War II wasn't just about defeating an army. It was about revealing the deepest truth of all. That sometimes, the most powerful victories are the ones no one ever sees.